There was some very striking scenes last week when a free speech protest that was organised outside of the Irish Parliament by a multitude of Irish patriots and concerned citizens was countered by a somewhat larger demonstration. And it's interesting, this demonstration was made up of people before profit of various Trotskyist, Marxist, socialist groupings. It had Sinn Féin, one of the mainstream left-wing social democrat parties. It had elements of the new IRA and leftist terrorists that are directly linked to the murder of a journalist in the north this year. And it also had a number of NGOs, non-governmental organisations, anti-racist campaign groups, various charities, various lobbyist organisations for different racial groups, open border advocacy groups. But what was most interesting about all this was that Garrod Murphy, a citizen journalist, uncovered that most of these groups, these NGOs that were supporting this so-called Rally for Peace, which was a counter-demonstration to try and silence a real organic movement, a rally for free speech, that was organised to oppose hate speech laws. These groups were almost entirely funded by the Irish state. These NGOs, many of them have anything from 20 to 90, close to 100% funding from the Irish state. So it was this situation where there was a multitude of groups organised to defend the government introducing strict hate speech laws and to silence any opposition to this. So it seems that the state was basically paying to have what appeared to be an organic movement to silence the real organic movement. Now, this scenario may seem surprising, even paradoxical to many, but for someone who's understood the work of Italian social theorist Bertrand de Juvenel, this is actually a perfect example of how power dynamics function in the realm of the political. So the thesis of de Juvenel is that power expands itself to the detriment of the social order by making alliances with the lowest classes against the intermediate social authorities that are capable of regulating power. So in this case, the social authority that would be capable of, say, regulating the government here and pulling them back on the absurd introduction of hate speech laws would be this concerned middle ground of working people that pay taxes and pay for the upkeep of these NGOs, and they're concerned about the loss of freedom of speech. By social order, de Juvenel means the capacity for society's members to regulate their own conduct through customs and traditions. And so you see in this middle ground, it's a much more traditional Irish grouping. It's made up of Irish men and women with much more traditional belief systems. But power, which was originally set up as a guardian of this order, as the Irish state was set up to defend Irish men and Irish women and to defend the traditional Celtic way of life. This guardian breaks its leash by turning on it and becoming a subversive force, as the Irish state has in the last number of years, and people are still adjusting to this. And this doesn't just apply to Ireland, this applies to the whole Western world. And this is something that's been going on throughout history. De Juvenel uses the example of the 100 Years' War to illustrate his point. He writes, "To raise contributions, power must invoke the public interest. It was in this way that the 100 Years' War, by multiplying the occasions on which the monarchy was forced to request the cooperation of the people, accustomed them in the end, after a long succession of occasional levies, to a permanent tax, an outcome which outlived the reasons for it." So this high-low alliance against the middle was also represented in antiquity by the alliance of the tyrant and the mob, which culminated in Caesar's overthrow of the Roman Republic in the teeth of the aristocratic opposition. Long after the centralised Roman state had collapsed into a feudal social order overseen by a weak and regulated power, the same dynamic reappeared in the twilight of the Middle Ages. as kings consolidated their power at the expense of the nobility with the help of plebeian clerks and jurists. And when the very presence of a king proved to be a restraint in itself, the democratic revolution summarily dispensed with him, allowing power to expand itself even further by conflating its will with that of the whole people. In this way, the Enlightenment, the growth of classical liberalism, and the political revolutions of the 18th century can be understood not as a realization of individual liberty, but merely a consolidation of power by the real elites of the time from the monarchy and the church. In light of this, then, the support of Western elites for foreign immigrants against native citizens no longer confuses us. Power is simply up to its old game of subversion and expansion, conscripting the immigrants into the role of the loyal plebeians and treating the white nations of Europe as though they were defiant noble houses. So to summarise, power in conjunction with social agitators is engaging in subversive conflict against a third power centre, the conservative element of society, which is the impediment to power acting. As Juvenal writes, if the natural tendency of power is to grow, and if it can extend its authority and increase its resources only at the expense of the notables, it follows that its ally for all times is the common people. The passion for absolutism is inevitably in conspiracy with the passion for equality. This arrangement creates a situation in which the acting institutions must always self-efface and instead manufacture a narrative of the oppressed, acting to free themselves from the oppression of the fictitiously stronger conservative element, a socially acceptable disguise for power engulfing enemies. And as in the case of the protests in Ireland, that the fight of the oppressed happens so effortlessly, is funded so miraculously well, and all decisions go in its favour is then presented as the march of progress or some other form of historical determinism. And this explains how the rabble of NGOs and state-funded advocacy groups brought together to quell a genuine people's movement and defend the consolidation of power by a treacherous central government could still present themselves as the victims, rallying for world peace against the oppressive mob of fascists that are apparently oppressing the weakest members of society. And you look at the paradox of these communist groups defending a centre-right Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil establishment government, defending a crackdown on free speech, and claiming that this is a rally for world peace, that this is some kind of organic movement, that these people are the oppressed, when they're going to use the whole force of the state to oppress the people on the opposite side of the street. So this is all explained by the Juvenal as the central power structure, consolidating power from that dangerous middle that still has traditions and ways of life that could be detrimental to it. To break this model down further, we can say we have a mixture of actors all acting within the logic of their respective places in the system. So at the top, we appear to have a mixture of actors engaging in cynical usage of agitators as a means to undermine enemies, this being the Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil coalition government, the establishment media, and multinational corporations that are propping up the Irish economy, on which these political parties depend. As well as this, you do have a genuine belief on the part of other actors in the validity of promoting the same agitators. Here, the example would be someone like folk musician Christy Moore, who has traditionally supported Irish nationalist movements and opposition to neoliberalism, but he now supports the foot soldiers of the same system on the mistaken belief that they're a grassroots movement fighting for justice and equality. In conjunction with this, then, we have the agitators and the grassroots support that either genuinely believes that this social progress is happening or, again, is operating on more cynical motives. Whatever the ultimate motives, we see that there are generally two groups here. The power actors dispersing money and support to promote the agitators and their immediate helpers, and the agitators and immediate helpers themselves. it's clear that without the first group, the second group would merely cease to be able to function. The validity of this is provided by the manner in which the foundations which process these funds have been the engines of social change in a direct fashion throughout history. For example, the civil rights movement in the US was led by the umbrella group, the Council for United Civil Rights Leadership, which was set up by Stephen Currier and his wife, Audrey Bruce Currier, who are of the Mellon family fortune. And they also received significant funding from the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, among other founding sources. In light of this, the alliance between the neoliberal establishment of Ireland and the far-left foot soldiers is nothing new, but merely the latest example of the high-low versus the middle conflict that is, in fact, always the basis of the chief political centre consolidating power. While the useful idiots waving red flags outside Dáil Éireann, attacking genuinely concerned Irish people as racists and Nazis, think that they're behaving in an organic fashion, they think that they're working for the progress of history towards equality and justice, they are in fact serving as the useful idiots, serving as the foot soldiers for an establishment that is engaging in power politics, the kind of which we've seen throughout history and that were outlined perfectly by Bertrand the Juvenel.